join us here, and I'm going to get to our second speaker. I'd like to introduce Dr. Dan Varga. Dr. Varga joined Texas Health Resources in 2013. He was the system's first chief clinical officer. He is also senior executive vice president. As the CCO, is responsible for achieving integration of the entire Texas Health clinical enterprise, and he is including in that, obviously, quality and patient safety, which we're here for today. With the creation of Southwestern Health Resources in 2016, Dr. Varga also serves as the Senior Executive Officer of the Southwestern Health Physician Network and Southwestern Health Accountable Care Network. So he has got three big jobs there. Texas Health and UT Southwestern Medical Center did create Southwestern Health, as y'all know, in this market as an integrated network that blends the strengths of those organizations. Dr. Varga received his bachelor's degree at the University of Kentucky and his medical education at the University of Louisville. We're very glad to also have him visit Texas and now live here in Texas with us. He's board certified in internal medicine, and I hope you will help me in welcoming Dr. Varga. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So thanks for having me here today. It's a real privilege and an honor to be here with Dr. Nasidi and with Sam and with all of you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of this disease here, not just here in Dallas and Fort Worth, but even more intimately inside Texas Health Resources, even more intimately inside Texas Health Dallas Presbyterian, and also talk about the impact to our people. And I hope to leave you with 10 thoughts, not commandments, but 10 thoughts about preparing and then managing so that you can think through this. And I think to a large extent the approach I want to talk about is applicable to any threat to safety as you think through this. So on the 28th of September, I was, speaking of safety, I was driving back from Fort Lauderdale with my son's car. He'd gone back to college at the University of Texas, Austin. And my wife and I went and visited my brother. He had been in an internship with my brother's company down in Florida. He got to fly to Dallas. We got to fly to Florida and then drive his car back. So we're on this road trip on the 28th, and I get a phone call, or I get a call that says, we have a patient with Ebola at Dallas. Fortunately, I was this side of Orlando and diverted to the airport, got on a plane, flew here, and our adventure with the first Ebola patient diagnosed in the U.S. happened. And that was a really life-changing day for Texas Health Resources and for Presbyterian. Very life-changing. What we learned at that very specific time, I'm going to tell you, we'll go to the outcomes. The outcomes were actually amazing given the potential risk, as Dr. Nasidi just described. We had a gentleman who had fairly broad contact with a lot of different people, was living in very tight confines in an apartment with a whole lot of family members. And the upshot of all that was that there were 3 cases in Dallas. The index case, 2 healthcare workers who were caring for that patient, and nobody else. And that's a great tribute to this community, to the public health infrastructure of this community, to government in this area, to the CDC, and a bunch of other colleagues that really helped manage this. Unfortunately, we had 1 death, and that was the index patient. That index patient was a diagnosis we missed. And we missed it, not because we didn't care, not because we didn't try, and not because we didn't think about it in advance. We missed the diagnosis because we made some assumptions and we created some illusions for ourselves that were the root cause of why we missed a diagnosis and by extension perhaps lost the opportunity to diagnose earlier, treat earlier, and actually have 0 deaths from the cases that we had arrive here. So I want to give you, as I said, 10 concepts that are important, and I'm going to frame this very much within the context of what it means to prepare for and manage a novel event. Not just any event. You guys are really smart. You know what to do with influenza. It's coming up, right? We'll be all prepared for that. We'll start that process. You know how to deal with HIV and hepatitis C and everything else. This is, what do we do with a novel event? First rule, first concept is remember that novel events are novel, right? So on the 25th of September, a gentleman from West Africa presented to the emergency department with nonspecific symptoms. He didn't come in with a neon sign that said, "Hello, I have Ebola." He came in with nonspecific symptoms. And we would have been prepared for somebody who walked in with a neon sign that says, "Hello, I have Ebola." But we weren't prepared for that. And this was one of the major reasons that we missed this first opportunity to diagnose, was because we didn't achieve an appropriate balance between preparing for the novel and running the risk of missing the opportunity to diagnose the novel, and being highly diligent and redundant and passionate about taking care of the common. So I won't go into all the details, but one of the reasons that we missed the opportunity is we had, and we'll talk about this in a minute, we had some discordance between intake information on the patient's travel history. It's widely known in this community now. So we missed that. And one of the reasons we missed that was because we had just gone through, this was September, right? We were hyper-focused on influenza and not having people sit in the waiting room with nonspecific symptoms and infect everybody else, but get them back to the room where we could identify stuff, et cetera. And we missed an opportunity for an early triage, an early flag, that sort of thing. We also were, relative to HIPAA and some other things, not really wanting to hang a big sign on the front door that said, "Hi, if you have come from any of these places, you should tell us right now because we're going to ask you," et cetera. We figured we'll get that in our intake when we come in. But we had an imbalance between the opportunity to diagnose the novel and our obsession with precision and performance on the common. So that's something to remember. We don't advocate that everybody treat everybody as somebody who might have Ebola, but you have to create a balance, and we were imbalanced in that regard. The second message I would say in preparing for the novel event is own your stuff. I agree with Dr. Nasidi that the CDC is one of the great assets that we have in this country. We took them at face value. We took the CDC recommendations, we broadly disseminated them, we looked at them, and what do you look at when you look at the CDC recommendations for contact and droplet precautions, right? You look and go, we do it every day, right? We do this all the time. We don't necessarily do it all the time when we're managing somebody who has 15, 17, 18 liters of diarrhea, but we do it all the time. So we figure that we've got that pretty well nailed. The other thing is germane to that, is that when you own your stuff, you don't just take the recommendations and say, we'll do these things. We have to be able to integrate them seamlessly into your operations platform. And we didn't do that well enough in that setting. And because of that, we probably had a scenario where we had an undue exposure of our healthcare workers in our system to potential risk. But it's a big issue. And that was something that we have learned coming out of that, is that you take anybody's recommendation, CDC, WHO, whoever it happens to be, we'll take their recommendations, but it's got to get integrated into the way we do work. It's just absolutely critical. A third element that I want folks to really remember, and again, I'm not trying to be overly critical of ourselves, but this is for lessons learned, is that information development and dissemination is not enough. You have to learn it and train it. You literally have to learn it and train it. In our situation, this was, we disseminated, we developed information, disseminated information on Ebola. Everybody had seen it, it was all out. We can document going back months and months and months and months that we had done that. But we really didn't train on that, document that everybody had learned, had everybody documented around high-level PPE and everything else. But relative to the PPE, that was really not my most important issue. The most important thing we didn't learn and train was how to diagnose Ebola, how to identify it and diagnose it. Our nurses were really good. All of our staff are really good at doing what they do relative to PPE. But this was at the medical end of the spectrum. We didn't train with our doctors and others to make sure that we were really, really good at asking the question at the right place, at the right time, communicating that information to everybody that needed to know, and then starting the process of diagnosing. We sent it out and said, be on the watch for Ebola. And so, big difference between development of information, dissemination of information, and actually learning and training on the information. Which has a corollary, fourth rule, which is the presence of data does not equal that the data has been seen and understood. So, probably well known now that within our ED on that first presentation, that a nurse took a travel history and said the patient came from Africa. The physician took his own history, timing almost contemporaneous to the nurse actually entering her data into the electronic health record. Took the same and said the patient came from Vickery Meadows, both of which were true. And neither of those data points were communicated one to the other in that setting. Now, as you look at that, you guys know Dallas-Fort Worth. We live right down the street from Vickery Meadows, large West African immigrant population. These are our folks. They come to our ED every day. It is no surprise to us that somebody with an accent similar to Dr. Nciti's would come into our ED and say, hi, I'm from Vickery Meadows, and we'd go, yes, of course you are, and we would bring them in, and you got nonspecific symptoms, and we would take care of them like they were somebody from Vickery Meadows. But somewhere else in that EHR, there was sitting a piece of data that said the patient came from Africa. So the presence of data does not mean the data has been communicated or understood. And we have fixed that, which has another corollary, which data has to be where it can be used by the people who need to use it. And this was one of the things for us was we didn't have a synchronization of clinical workflow that made sense. We do now. And I would argue on all of these things, I will tell you right now that at THR, we do now. But we learned that. But it was a really important aspect for us to learn, which is that you actually had to have clinical workflow that put that information where it could actually be used. One thing that I think we still feel a little raw about at THR is this, and I would urge everybody as you do your preparedness, is beware the illusion of communication and the illusion of workflow reliability. We can go back and look in Epic today, which is our information system, and I can show you where all of the data was for the index patient's first visit. I can show you where it all was. And that creates an illusion that there was data there, that data was communicated, that data was present in the workflow of the clinicians at the bedside, et cetera. And in fact, it wasn't. It was there, easily found if you wanted to go dig it up. But it wasn't where people live, which is nurses, doctors, everybody live in their workflow every day. So if it's something really is important, you got to get it in there. And it goes back to my very first statement, and you can't make sure that everything you think might be important gets in their workflow, because you know what happens then. It's alert fatigue, and they don't even look at it, and they ignore it, et cetera. So if it's important right now, you got to get it into a place where people can see it and use it. I do want to say that now I want to talk a little bit about what happens if it happens. What happens if you happen to get confronted with the novel event? And the first thing I would tell you is, as you think about preparedness on this, and I think Dr. Nasidi mentioned this a little bit earlier, the first thing I would urge you to do is think about and stay focused on what it means for the patient who might present. Now, the patient who presented here had a lot of negative press all over the U.S. Didn't tell the truth at the time of getting on the airplane in Liberia to come over here. Wasn't 100% forthcoming with the first presentation in the hospital, blah, 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 blah. On the return to the emergency department on the 28th, we got a phone call from EMS saying, we are bringing a patient with Ebola. That was a phone call. A patient with Ebola is coming to your ED right now. That's the neon sign, right? That's you get the neon sign then. The patient was absolutely forthcoming. The family's absolutely forthcoming at that juncture because they're an extremist. But I would ask you you guys are all healthcare professionals, so think back. I was a resident at the time. Think back to this scenario. In the mid-'80s, if you were working in an emergency department in Dallas, Texas, and a patient from San Francisco walked in your ED and said, I've lost 50 pounds, I have night sweats and fevers, I have this very strange purple rash, and I'm homosexual and I attend the bath scene there. Do you think they would have told you that? And the answer is no, because you know if that's what you do, you just gave yourself a death sentence, right? AIDS in 1984, somebody's not going to come in with a neon sign. I would tell you somebody who just buried their daughter in Liberia in the throes of one of the biggest outbreaks of Ebola that's ever happened is not going to come in and say, I think I got Ebola. Because from that cultural perspective, you know what that means. It means I'm likely to die. And so it's incumbent on us in these novel events to put ourselves in the shoes of the patient and understand what we have to do, make them comfortable telling us what we need to know. It's absolutely critical. It's absolutely critical, and I can't emphasize that enough. The other thing I would urge is to understand this happened, and this would have happened if we made the diagnosis up front or if we had made the diagnosis 3 days later, is the hysteria is real. It's Ebola. It's in our house now, right? It's in our city now. It's in our state. It's in our country. It is a big mistake to embrace the hysteria. It is also a big mistake to ignore the hysteria because it's real. I'll just give you a story. I'm not going to get into incident command and all this other sort of stuff because you guys know that better than I do. But incident command is usually what? Business continuity. We do it with a natural disaster. The heat, the power is gone, etc. This was a disaster. This was an incident command that was caused by a clinical event. And so we actually ended up having to put in place a 24-hour-a-day hotline to physicians. And myself, the other CMOs in our system, a lot of our physician executives participated in this. And we took calls 24 hours a day. Incident command would get a call, they'd route it to us if it was a clinical call. Got a call, it was really interesting, from a lady who was at dinner, a very nice place in Dallas, who said, I think I have Ebola, that I was just exposed to Ebola. And we said, now you know what the epidemiology of Ebola is, right? And the pathophysiology of Ebola is. And so you have my interest at this point in time. And I said, why would you think that? And she goes, there are 2 American airline pilots sitting at a table next to me. And they flew the plane that one of the nurses was on from Cleveland to Dallas. So I think I have Ebola. And without, the flippant answer would have been, so are they having diarrhea right there in the middle of the restaurant? Are they throwing up on your table, et cetera? Are they doing anything? But the answer is going, no. So let me tell you how you get Ebola. And we did this hundreds of times. That was managing the hysteria, not embracing or ignoring it. But it is a real element to deal with. The other piece, and this is something I'm not describing as a negative, but describing as a reality, and that is very quickly it becomes hard to distinguish between political science, social science, and medical science. So I was on a travel list because at one juncture in this thing with one of the diagnoses of our nurses, I put on my high-level PPE and went with the chief nursing officer from Dallas into a room to tell nurse that we had confirmed they had Ebola. And because of that, I was on our 30-day exposure list, which I was incredibly low risk, and somehow or another that got me on the Homeland Security list. And it literally took a call from one of our senators to Homeland Security to say, he's not a terrorist, and so forth. But that was an example of where social science and political science got in the way. And there was a lot of things, kind of the quarantining of our very, very low-risk health workers and other sorts of things happened. But I would tell you that if you step back and said, given the index case and the number of people exposed in a very intimate way to the index case, the fact that no other citizen of Dallas, Texas contracted Ebola was exceptional public health work, whatever the rules that they were that put in place. And they weren't evidence-based, rules. But whatever those rules were, we had no transmission other than to 2 healthcare workers. So it worked, but understand you have to be prepared to do your part. And I think Sam will talk about that a little bit here in a second. But you also have to be prepared to stand down. And there are times when you have to be prepared to be a good soldier in this setting and live with that. And so I would urge you to remember that. And more than anything, I think this is probably most important, is remember your people. There's not one of you in here who are part of healthcare that aren't here for a really altruistic, humanistic, compassionate reason. That's why you're here. That's why you do this work. You all are way smart. You could get a whole lot more money working other places, but that's why you do this here. And just imagine, as you manage this, what your people are going through. They're scared. In our situation, they were really, really hurt by the negative public discussion around who THR is, who Presbyterian was, etc. And I would tell you, even now, it's a really very emotional piece for us because we've bounced back from it. We've done really, really well. We're proud of who we are. But it was a tough period of time. And I remember we had a town hall at Presbyterian, and everybody came in. It was kind of one of these great cathartic events where, we had, our nurses were now at Emory and NIH. Things had kind of settled down. We had no new cases, kind of dealing with things, and we talked about it. And one of the doctors in the room got up and said, "I'd like to punch Anthony Fauci in the mouth," because what he said about us when, as he's doing news conferences from NIH. And I remember I said, look, I just want you all to remember something. At Emory, at NIH, group of people get up every morning, they come into the hospital, they put on their high-level PPE, they say, let's go in and take care of some Ebola. That's what they do. They're trained to do that. So you get up every morning, put on your scrubs, go to the ED, go to the ICU and say, send us what you got and we'll take care of it. And one day, for the first time in the history of ever, somebody walked in with nonspecific symptoms off the street and they had Ebola. I would tell you, I would still come to your hospital. And I think we all need to remember that. That was, for those folks, they needed such an affirmation that what they do every day is still okay. And when you're in these novel crises, and I heard some good friends from Orlando who talked about the nightclub shooting and just the overwhelming burden that put on their staff. Because the way that played out from a public health standpoint, if you didn't know it, was they sealed the accident scene, the shooting scene, and took everybody that was not already deceased at the site to Orlando Regional. All come in, they're all in the level 1 trauma unit. They're all in surgery, and every family member who had somebody at the nightclub came to the hospital. And it was notification of death by exclusion. I think only a couple people passed away that were alive when they reached the trauma center. So as people came out and said, Mrs. Smith is doing okay, she just came out of OR, everyone who had died at the scene found out that somebody had died at the scene by exception. We've accounted for all the people who've gone through surgery or in the ICU, et cetera, and if your name hadn't been called, then your issue's over at the nightclub. And for the staff of a health system to deal with that is just crushing. It's just really crushing. And so remember, as you manage this, remember your people. And I will tell you that there's a couple quick rules that I will tell you that got us, I won't even say got us, got me through this. So when I was much, much younger, I remember reading and then remembering forever something out of this encyclical that was written by Pope Paul VI called Ecclesiam Sum. You don't need to remember that. But in this, he's talking about how the Catholic Church should have a more open dialogue with the world. And what was really the big takeaway for me, and there were four points, the 4 points of a dialogue. And this is how a dialogue should go. It should, first and foremost, transparency and clarity, above all. And I think as we looked at this, we tried more than anything to be transparent and clear where we screwed up, what we were doing, who was at risk, etc. The second element was humility. And you have to be humble enough in a dialogue with the community, and we're always in dialogue with the community, but particularly in a crisis, you're in dialogue, is be humble. We have enormous resources, enormous talent, enormous assets, but you have to stand there humbly and say, I don't know everything. I have to be part of a community team. CDC knows more than I do. Emory and NIH can take care of our nurses better than we can. You have to bring a humility to the conversation. The third element is belief. And this was the hardest thing for us, I will tell you. Belief in this dialogue, in who you are and what you represent, but also belief in the good intentions of the person you're having the dialogue with. Now, you could easily have said, I really wish that, CNN and MSNBC and Fox and everybody would just go away and leave us alone because they're just trying to stir up muck, etc. But if you take the approach to say they really want to get the truth out in front of the people, if you look and say when you do an interview on Good Morning America with Dr. Bazell, that he really just wants to get your opinion appropriately out in front of everybody. You bring a different perspective to the story. And the fourth piece is a very bizarre term called pedagogical prudence. But what it means is being able to stand in the shoes of the person you're having the dialogue with. And if you're looking at the hysterical community and you're standing in their hysterical shoes, it's a lot different conversation than if you're just saying it's some crazy lady who called up from a restaurant who says, I think I have Ebola. So we remembered those 4 things all along. And they were really critical for us being able to get through it. And I want to leave you, because I think I got 31 seconds. I'm going to leave you with one other thing that I would hope you remember. As we're doing this, the one thing you have to be able to do in this, both in your preparedness and in your execution, and then in dealing with this after the fact, is you have to be able to stand by who you are and what you are, and do that. And it takes courage. It takes a lot. But one of my favorite authors is a Kentuckian. I'm from Kentucky, a guy named Wendell Berry. And he's a farmer in Henry County and former laureate of the state of Kentucky. But I want you to remember this. So when you make a promise to someone and to someone else's future, if the promise is serious enough, one is brought to it by love and in awe and in fear. Fear, awe, and love bind us to no selfish aims, but to each other, and they enforce a speech more exact, more clarifying, and more binding than any speech that can be used to sell or to advocate. For when we promise in love and awe and fear, there's a certain kind of mobility that we give up. We're speaking where we stand, and we shall stand afterwards in the presence of what we have said. And it's that sort of commitment that I know all of you guys do every day. It's why you're here committed to safety. And when you make a statement that says it's safety first, that it's first do no harm, it's keep me safe. When you make that statement, I want you to remember that you have to stand by that statement forever. And everything you do has to extend from that. We made a mistake in this proposition, but I don't think we ever missed that proposition, that we would stand by the proposition that we'd put forward. So, thank you very much for the opportunity to chat, and I'll look forward to the panel.